Dr. Hezema, now some have asked whether it's legal to lay people off during a pandemic like this. I want to find out if it is indeed the case that there is a law that characterizes or governs laying off of people during a pandemic.
Thank you very much, Alfred. And the first point I'd like to raise around the control of employment is the fact that in a pandemic like the coronavirus, which was unforeseen and has a significant impact, it frustrates very control of employment between two parties, being the employer and employee. When there is such a significant frustration which was not planned or foreseen by either party, it gives grounds to the law for the contract to become null and void, because the very foundation on which that kind of employment is supposed to happen has diluted, no more exists. So if somebody has a contract of employment with a company which has been hit with the coronavirus, the pandemic, my brother mentioned of the aviation and leisure industry, which literally doesn't exist anymore, there's no place applying, and people are hardly using hotels. If this is the case, the very foundation which was on onset being having to work, for example, in airline, and the airline no more existing, means there is no contract of employment. To that extent, it's not about either party even going ahead to breach the contract. The contract itself by law doesn't exist. So is it right, or is it perceived as being legal to lay off staff or to put redundancy? It's not here or there, because in the context of the frustration, which is significant, the contract itself is declared null and void.
I see. So this is circumstantial termination of employment. Is that what the case is?
Yes, yes.
I see. But then again, just as you made point that this is unforeseen. So in a circumstance like this, are the people who are laid off entitled to any packages whatsoever? At
this point, I'd like to differentiate between this kind of constitutional contract and a redundancy. When companies plan a redundancy or they foresee a redundancy, it means that there's a deliberate effort to change the ways of work or change the production or the types of work that people do. And that is the foundation for a package, because it is not the fault of the employee. However, the employer has preconceived this change in ways of work. In this circumstance, because not foreseen, and the employer itself would actually be running bankrupt because the company is in shambles, the employee does not necessarily have a legal right to demand a redundancy package. However, in good faith and also on humanitarian grounds, the employer could decide to work out a package of sorts to give to the employee. But in this case, it is not illegal if employees are laid off without any packages. Again, I state on humanitarian grounds, nobody wishes such a pandemic to happen. If anybody foresaw this coming, there would have been plans to mitigate it, but nobody foresaw it coming. Employers are losing capital, they are losing a lot of business. Shareholders are upset because they've lost every investment and all that. So employees themselves should really try and find a negotiating point with the employer for some sort of compensation, if possible, but it is not binding by law for that happens. This is not a redundancy. And the redundancy in the Act 651 of Ghana, 2003 version, redundancy is one that has to be negotiated with the employer by either the employee or the representatives, in this case, the union or the mother union, and there has to be notice given to the chief officer. In this unforeseen pandemic, no such thing can happen. So it's out of the benevolence of the employer to be able to give a handshake of sorts to the employees.
I see. Pretty interesting analysis you make right there. I'm bringing Mr. Koomson now. So yeah, what Dr. Hazel is saying, substantial, termination of employment is nobody's fault. There's a pandemic. You have to go home. How do you react to this from the position of the law, Mr. Koomson?
I think it's quite important. I have listened to Doc, but I think it's quite important that we clearly establish a matter in this case, that the doctrine of frustration should be actually tempered with a bit of caution. We should appear to disturb that doctrine without doing a very detailed analysis of the issues as in sector by sector and look at the subject areas, subject matters, and so forth. You can only say that there's frustration, okay, when the subject matter is a radical change in the subject matter as far as the conduct is concerned. So, for instance, aviation may say, okay, our main source of income is flights grounded. But when you come to, say, manufacturing, say, textile, or you go to mines or cocoa processing companies, you may realize that if you do a critical impact assessment, you will come to a conclusion that the impact as in what happens in the aviation and air is not the same thing going through one sector to the other. Again, it's also important that we understand that the labor law, Section 8 of the Labor Act, okay, provides that the employer has the right to terminate an employee. That is the right that the law actually has made for. That provides the legal grounds for the employer, a right that has been given by the law, that the employer can terminate. But in Section 15 of the same Act, exercising that right, there are grounds for which you can exercise that right. And one is where the parties have mutually agreed to extinguish their obligation or bring their obligations to a halt. Two, where the parties, there's incompetence, gross misconduct, medical condition that the board of the state or medical board have actually certified that the person can no more perform. And such other grounds provided in Section 15 of the Act. Now, COVID-19 or frustration in any shape or form has never been contemplated by the Labor Act. Again, in the conditions of service that we have signed with the employers, there is no single term or provision that contemplates frustration, looking at a public health emergency as being grounds to trigger the severance or termination of the terms of the conditions of service. So it's important that we do not appear to be creating law or in making a certain creating an impression that there's a position in the law that actually contemplates where we stand today. There is no provision like that. Now, what is happening, like I've said earlier on, we all recognize that COVID-19 is an enemy to both the employer and the employee, okay? So the approach that International Labour Organization and the UN have prescribed for us to adopt as the approach to deal with this pandemic and deal with the excesses of COVID-19 is to dialogue, okay?
Right.
For the employer and the employee to sit down to discuss and look at what are the issues, because let us not forget that there are those we call corporate predators, okay, who capitalize on COVID-19 to victimize and to lay off without necessarily